Good. Yeah, so landscape architect with the National Park Service. I've been with the service since about 2012. Came on board to kind of start up the visual program and help parks respond to projects that are beginning to be built and you know, primarily energy development near parks. And that kind of what was the driver for kind of getting the visual program going. So what we're going to talk about here the next little bit is what we call language of landscapes. And it is really about the vocabulary. And I think the key is that these are all words that everybody's familiar with. We're just going to put them in a little bit different context and how we use them in the visual resource world in the description and talking about landscape. So I don't think there's really anything really new here. It's just maybe using the words a little bit differently. So what we want to do is just understand that basic descriptive language. We're going to concentrate on three kind of primary components. There's a little bit more to this, but in the limited time that we have, we're going to focus on just kind of what we call either a landscape or a view type. There's a number of those that are going to be kind of in either or both. Much of this is based on foundational elements that the BLM has taught for years. In the National Park Service, we use some of the terms and things for slightly different needs. And I think that's the key takeaway from this track over the next week, is that we're doing things, very kind of customized for our individual missions, but there's a basic foundational element here that's similar among all the programs and all the things that you talk about with the scenic landscapes. And we talk about character or design elements and distance zones, where you might use those things a little bit differently, but they have similar effects in the landscape. So as mentioned, these are familiar words in a new context. And one of the key things is, using this similar terminology, it's easier to set kind of a common baseline condition. And that way, all of the, people that are communicating about the landscape, they're using similar terminology so that there's, better communication. And I think that's one of the key things when you're talking about potential impacts and how you might, mitigate those in the landscapes. So, and its relationship to NEPA, you can see there, this kind of relates to the affected environment piece and stuff. We want to describe what those existing conditions are. So when we look at landscapes and view types, so a landscape type, in the BLM system is an area of the landscape, and for the parks, we look at it from a visitor perspective, or a view as a composition. There's basically about 7 different types, I think. Six are on here. So on our first one is a panoramic landscape, and these are probably very familiar. These big, broad, horizontal compositions. Okay, there's very little in the background, or maybe you might end up with a mountain range or something that's very, very distant. But the sky and the foreground really dominate. I mean, it's a 50-50 split stuff. So you really have this big, long, broad horizontal composition in the landscape. And enclosed is kind of the opposite of that. Now you've got some boundaries. There's a floor, there's walls around it. So there's something there to stop that view. So it's contained, if you will. And it can be different scales. It can be, you see there one photo that's there on a scale of a meadow or something like that. It can be, rather intimate, or a big broad valley that has that backdrop to it and stuff. But there's some kind of a boundary there that kind of contains that view. A feature view or feature landscape, there's a thing there to look at. There's a purpose generally to why view might be in a location, and there's actually something to look at, and they can be man-made, or natural features. It can be cultural features, like in the photo on the right, as a significant cultural view near Chaco National Historical Park. So it doesn't have to be a named feature, but oftentimes they are. But there's something there. There's a reason. There's a focal point. There's a thing that you're going to be looking at, and that's generally the purpose of having maybe a view in a certain spot. A focal view, on the other hand, is a little bit the same. Your eye is drawn to a particular location, but there doesn't have to be anything there. It's just the way that the landscape in a particular view, the topography in an area, how the lines work and how the forms work to draw your eye, in a particular landscape. And so there can be done with, as you see on the left, it can be man-made, kind of features, trails and roads. But oftentimes it's just simply the way the landscape works. You've got the forms that kind of focus your eyes in a particular location. And this becomes important, much like the feature view. If changes occur near, that focal point or near those features, that becomes a real challenge then from a mitigation standpoint and stuff. So that's why you want to really understand what you're looking at as far as a landscape type, so that you understand a little bit about its vulnerabilities before you start to understand, what a particular project might, how a particular project might impact an area. So a framed view or a framed landscape, these are a little bit self-explanatory. It's kind of a little bit sort of looking through a window, but there's some boundaries on it. There's some kind of constriction or framing mechanism that really kind of keeps your view focused in a particular area. There can be a different landscape type, beyond there. You could be looking out at a feature, through a framed view. So there's often a combination a little bit in these situations, because you might have a big, broad, horizontal panoramic view beyond through the frame. But it's important because, again, that vulnerability, if a change occurs within that frame, then it can be more noticeable. And that's why you want to set these things up and understand what kind of landscape you have to start to understand its vulnerabilities. A canopied landscape, you certainly have these in the East. When I was working with, a lot of the BLM inventories in the West, these don't occur, very often, but these might be really potentially some of your most vulnerable landscapes. And just because they've got that top on them, many times they might be enclosed as well. So you've got a lot of things going on in a canopied landscape, because you also have that little bit of that overhead plane kind of ceiling restriction that kind of contains your view in a really kind of a focused area. So character design, or what we call design elements, visual elements, character elements, you'll hear a little bit different terms on it, but most everybody is going to be, in any kind of a program, is going to be talking about form, line, color, and texture. And these are really important, because then you can understand what might be inconsistent in some kind of a proposal that's proposed for a particular area of landscape. Something that has a higher level of contrast can be more visible. And then as a design or a character, you understand what these features are, then you can start to understand mitigation strategies and how things might be modified, relocated, or tweaked a little bit so that they fit in a little bit better and maybe reduce that contrast. So form. Form is the kind of the shape or the structure, kind of a 2D or 3D aspect, if you will. As you see here, there's some typical vocabulary that can be associated with this. There's no limit on what that vocabulary is. You can think of new terms or anything that used to describe, those shapes and forms of the landscape. And it's also then good to understand, what might be rolling, whether you've got a situation, you've got some rolling hills, or some rugged cliffs or mountain peaks and those kinds of things. So it's good to describe when you're making those descriptions, understand what the vocabulary is for those forms, then also describe what has those forms. Okay, so that helps. Again, you want to set this baseline description so that you understand where you are at the moment and where, how vulnerable things might be in the future. So lines. Lines are a little bit easier than forms. Often, this is kind of where your eye is drawn a little bit, somewhat related to the focal landscapes, if you will, but you see curves, or you see horizontal lines, or you see broken lines. These are the kind of things that, often maybe are on edges. They might be at, different shapes and the edges of forms. There might be lines in the changes in colors in the landscape. So there's a whole variety of ways that you can have lines in the landscape. And those lines are all subject to disruption. And in particular, horizon lines, whether it's a broad horizon or an undulating kind of irregular horizon, that horizon line can be particularly vulnerable. Color. So this is what you're probably, this is a major property of surfaces, and it's something that we all can comprehend fairly easily. You want to use good, rich vocabulary when you're describing colors. Light green, dark gray, bright red, rusty orange. Key takeaways with color is that generally the darker colors, they'll normally retreat. And if you've got bright, kind of lighter colors, those are going to be more noticeable. They're going to kind of come to the fore, if you will. And so it doesn't take a very big object of a light color to really be noticeable in a landscape. Whereas darker colors and things, even if they're relatively close or they're near other forms, it's easier to get them to blend in. Just because those darker colors don't attract your eye quite as much and stuff. And I think that's one of the keys, is that we often look at landscapes and see the colors that, like in the left photo, you've got some bright oranges and greens and those kinds of things up front. And when you start to describe colors, you really need to think about what you're actually seeing, not what you know the colors to be and stuff, because you can see in those mountains beyond, these really bright foreground shrubs, you can still see a little bit of color in some of those hills in the background. But as you get further away, you know that those colors and that vegetation, it's the same stuff. But now it's gray, it's kind of a grayish blue. It's not bright red and green and orange and stuff. So it's really important to concentrate on kind of what the colors look like, and especially when you have that effective distance. Those are no longer the same colors. They actually become kind of those washed out kind of blue-gray colors. And again, a couple of examples, on using, some rich terminology. It doesn't have to be stuck to, green, yellow, orange, red, the primary colors. It's good if you're describing a landscape to really enhance those descriptions, to understand, the more more details about the landscape, so that you can understand, how things might, better fit in or have high level of contrast. And texture is often for a person who's less experienced in doing this. Texture is a little bit of the harder one to sometimes kind of grasp. We're looking at kind of the surface textures and patterns on the surfaces of things. It's really, really affected by distance very quickly. So you get the most effective texture up close. There's some terms here that you can kind of think of the way that different aspects of texture come together. We like to think of especially terms like fine, medium, coarse, can generally, if you think of them as a convention, are sometimes more related to vegetation and kind of those land cover types of things, whereas a smooth or a medium or a rough texture is generally a little bit more associated with a surface, a surface of a building if it's up close, or what looks like the surface of a rugged mountain in the distance might seem more rough. So there's different ways of kind of thinking about the texture that might help kind of have the terminology come to mind. And then again, any kind of words that you can come up with to describe, the textures. And then again, those textures, if something's patchy, that might be a function of the way the vegetation is patterned in the landscape that creates those patches. So again, any of those terminologies, any of those vocabularies that you come up with in this descriptive aspect of form, line, color, texture, help to understand where that contrast is going to be most distinct. And here's again a couple of typical words. You can see in the upper right, that's where we might get this little patchy, vegetation on the hillside. The rest of, some of the others might be called stippled, is a term that's sometimes used. Grasses are generally kind of fine, even up close. And you can see in the lower right or the lower left, the vegetation. Kind of up close, you've got this little bit of a coarse desert vegetation. You move back a little bit and it becomes pretty, not quite as distinguishable. And then you get, just on the other side of the little canyon opening there, and there's really no texture at all to it. And you can see the same thing happening with the cliff faces, where the ruggedness really starts to smooth out with the distance. And that is a real common thing with texture, that it's much like color. It's very, very affected by distance. So the last thing that we'll talk about here a little bit are distance zones. And these are pretty, pretty understandable. I mean, things up close, you can see more detail. And certainly if a project is going to come in, some kind of a change is proposed in the landscape, the closer it is, the more you have to be conscious of, what that contrast might be and what those features might be and how it might fit into the landscape because of that level of detail. So foreground. So this is a little bit of a different approach, again, on how these terms, you might find them being used. For some programs in BLM, since it's a part of the inventory as far as how the inventory classes are determined, there's actual distances, and that's a critical part of how the analysis works. And so while I've kind of identified an immediate foreground here, generally a foreground to middle ground distance is, for kind of a 0 to 3 or 0 to 5 miles. Up to about a half mile, is where you can get some of those more kind of fine-tuned details. And in the NPS system, we don't put a distance on anything. We strictly look at it from a perspective of what you see from a particular location. And this is where in the foreground, we're looking at those human scale. You can see the details on buildings, you know, you can see the details on, you know, vegetation and those kinds of things. You might see activities and things up close as well, but those are kind of ephemeral kinds of things. So this is where you're in that landscape. You know, you're really part of that foreground and, you know, participating in that particular part of the landscape. Whereas when you look in the middle ground, this is where you're starting to have that feeling that you're looking at the landscape and stuff. And this is, again, from a distance standpoint, might be out to around 5 miles, maybe a little bit less, 3 to 4 miles in some kinds of landscapes. But this is where, you know, again, the patterns of the landscape and the patterns of the forms in the landscape kind of become the more dominant components rather than some of the individual features. You'll still identify, you know, individual buildings. You might see, you know, a particular tree or you know, a large rock outcrop. You'll certainly see individual elements in the landscape. But generally, you know, as you see in the lower left, you're going to start to see openings and patterns, you know, that kind of a thing. And the forms, you know, kind of start to tend to dominate in this middle ground distance zone a little bit. And then when you get to the background, it really is dominated by the forms. You know, you have the horizon really becomes a really distinctive aspect of, you know, the distance. It gives you some sense of the distance and stuff. And this goes out, you know, generally to about, you know, if you're going to, you know, do a background distance zone out to about 15 miles. Probably it needs to be extended a little bit when you start looking at, you know, potential for a wind project or something like that, just because of the visibility of structures, you know, is much more, structures like that are much more visible even at a little bit further distance than that. But again, you know, your landforms are going to dominate. And, you know, and I think one key thing is when you're in some kinds of landscapes, it's not necessary to have all 3 of these distance zones. And I think as you see here, you know, the lower left, you know, you've got some foreground and some background. I mean, there's really nothing in between. You know, this is how you start to visualize, if you can think about the landscape. It's like, well, you know, the foreground goes to about here, you know, because we've got this little ridge of vegetation in the foreground, and, you know, then we've got the horizon. And if there is a middle ground, you know, about where is it based on the things that you can see and the level of detail that is in that landscape. So with that, and again, this has been a pretty kind of quick overview. You know, I wanted to kind of get through this and leave some time for some questions. You know, again, familiar words, different context. So the key is to, you know, have some kind of a consistent vocabulary in trying to describe landscapes so that everybody's working from that kind of common basis in trying to understand then what is the level of effect? How are things going to change? What's going to attract the most attention? Where is the highest contrast? And how then, if there is, how can we fix that? And, you know, what are those methods? Do we move something behind so it's screen? Do we change the color if there's an opportunity to do that? You know, do we move it back and it, you know, go behind some screening? Or, you know, getting that description down is pretty key to understanding how you might be able to protect those values in the future. And I think with that, I can leave this up. I can go, let me leave this up, I guess, for the moment, see if there's any questions. That way I can flip back through slides, I guess, if
need be.
If it's helpful at all. If
Right.
it's helpful at all. Yep.
Mark, that was great. I feel like, you know, the way that you stressed why descriptors are so important is really helpful, especially, I mean, I've been in conversations with people and they don't always see the necessity or the value of doing that. They just want to get to scoring things, you know,
Right.
instead of sort of talking about what it is you're looking at.
Yep.
And I think when you start talking about, can this be done from a GIS perspective, having it, the descriptors, they're a lot harder to get at describing the landscape if you're just working from Google Earth or something else, because it's
Sure.
all skewed. So given the importance of being in person in a particular place, to do that is also critical.